Story 1. I had always loved my home. It was on the outskirts of a small town in northern Maine, far from the hustle and bustle, surrounded by woods and quiet hills. It was peaceful, and I felt I could find solace in the open spaces, away from people and worries. My backyard wasn't very big, but it opened into a forest that stretched for miles. It was a place I often escaped to when I needed to be alone, when my thoughts became too loud and the world around me became too hectic. It's been 3 years since I settled here. I knew every corner of these woods, every path. Over the years, they've become almost like family to me. There were moments when I walked along a familiar path, and it seemed to me that the forest itself was leading me, like an old friend who always knows what you want, even before you realize it. But everything changed last month. It was mid-May, when the weather was particularly warm for the time of year. I decided to go into the forest to enjoy the sunshine before the rain came. It always returned at this time, and I knew I had to take advantage of every moment when the sun was still shining. I started walking along my usual path, which led deep into the forest. It was a route I knew by heart. I walked slowly, enjoying the silence, interrupted only by the rustle of footsteps and the occasional sounds of nature. That day, it seemed to me that the world was even quieter than usual, as if something was hidden behind this unusual silence. After about 2 miles, I noticed that the birds had gone silent. It was strange. Usually at this time of year, they were full of life, their voices filling the air, but now there was complete silence. I looked around, but there was no sign that anything was wrong. The leaves of the trees were still, not swaying in the wind. The forest seemed dead. The silence was so deep that I felt uneasy. I continued walking, but the feeling of unease grew. And then I noticed something that immediately caught my attention, a small clearing that seemed completely unfamiliar. I often walk through these woods, but I had never noticed this place before. The clearing was strangely barren. The grass around it was dead, as if someone had cut it down, leaving a perfect circle about 15 feet in diameter. It looked like a hole in the heart of the forest, as if nature had decided to turn its back on this patch of land. In the center of this circle stood a stone well. It was small, about 3 feet high, with rough stones that were covered in moss. The moss looked strange, a dark purple, almost black. I moved closer to examine it. The stones were old, petrified by time, and seemed so unusual that I felt a growing curiosity. But there was something else too, something in the air that made me uneasy. With every step I took toward the well, it became more and more difficult to breathe. The air around me seemed thicker, as if it were becoming dense, viscous. The feeling was unbearably unpleasant, but I continued moving forward anyway. I stood in front of the well and looked inside. The darkness was so thick that I couldn't see the bottom. All I could see was a black void that stretched downwards. There was something inside that I couldn't understand, something that attracted me. It was so strange that I felt a slight shiver down my spine. I pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight and pointed the light downwards. That's when I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There was no water. There was nothing in the well that could be called a body of water. Instead, I saw eyes. Dozens of eyes blinking in the darkness, each moving independently of the others. I froze, unable to tear my gaze away, and then the eyes seemed to move. They all focused on me at once, and I heard a whisper, quiet, barely audible, but distinct, as if it were coming from right inside my head. Finally, my heart pounded in my chest. I dropped my phone, which fell into the well with a clatter. It sparkled in the darkness as the light from the screen touched something else, something thin, pale, that began to rise up. I knew I had to leave. At that moment, I thought of nothing else, only how to get out of this place as quickly as possible. I ran. I don't remember how long I ran, but I didn't stop until I was out of the woods. I ran into the backyard of my house as if the woods could catch me. My breathing was heavy, and my heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. I couldn't understand what had happened, but the feeling of fear wouldn't leave me. When I finally stopped, I looked around and realized that I couldn't figure out what scared me the most, the well itself or what I felt when I looked into its dark depths. I didn't know what to do, but something told me that this place, this forest, this well, was not simple. I felt that I had just encountered something that had no right to exist, but I couldn't figure out what it was. After I ran out of the forest, it took me a while to calm down. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The forest seemed as calm and silent as I knew it, but now every rustle of the wind, every sound was filled with some hidden meaning. My home, which had once been my refuge, seemed alien, and I no longer felt the silence and comfort that once brought me peace. I sat in my room trying to collect my thoughts, but the anxiety wouldn't leave me. As soon as I got home, it seemed to me that something had changed. The air in the house was heavy, as if an invisible threat was stuck in it. I tried to relax, but my gaze kept sliding to the windows, to the areas that looked out towards the forest. I kept feeling that someone was looking at me. I checked the door, the windows, but found nothing unusual. Everything was in place. It seemed like an ordinary night. But I knew that something had happened, and this feeling was impossible to ignore. When I went to bed, I had trouble falling asleep. I kept listening to the slightest sounds, trying to catch something that could explain my experiences. But there were no steps, no sounds, only complete silence. However, something in this silence was abnormal. This feeling that everything around was filled with hidden tension did not allow me to relax. Then late at night, when I was almost asleep, I heard it. The same sound that had been haunting me all day, a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make me jump. At first, I thought it might just be the wind playing with the trees. But no, it wasn't the wind. It was a human voice, but it wasn't real, wasn't human in the usual sense. It seemed to come not from behind the walls, but from the darkness itself, from inside my mind. I listened. The whisper was becoming clearer and clearer, and terribly it seemed familiar. It was my own voice, mine, but somehow different, distorted. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from, but its words were clear, if not quite distinct. "We're already on our way up. We found the way to your house." The words sent a chill through my chest. I froze. My blood ran cold and my head began to ring. How could I hear my own voice? Why was it saying those words? Why did it sound like it was someone else speaking on my behalf? In a panic, I jumped out of bed and went to the window, trying to understand what was happening. The forest was dark, hidden from the light, and I could not see anything unusual, but something was wrong. The feeling that someone was watching me became so strong that I almost physically felt the gaze of these invisible creatures. My eyes slid along the dark strip of trees, but nothing was visible except shadows. I wanted to turn and walk away from the window, but suddenly something made me look again. I saw the lights. They were faint, barely visible against the dark trees, and they were moving. At first they were just a few points of light, but with each passing minute, there were more of them. They moved between the trees like strange lights, not like normal flashlights. I didn't know what they were, but I saw them slowly approaching the house. I stood by the window, holding my breath, trying to figure out what was happening. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to close the windows, lock the doors, barricade everything I could, but instead I kept watching. And that's when I felt something change. The light in the forest, although it seemed to be flickering, was now growing brighter. These weren't ordinary lights. These were eyes. Dozens of tiny dots of light that moved as if they were alive. They didn't look like human eyes, but I knew they weren't flashlights. They moved quickly, as if their owners didn't want me to notice them. And despite their speed, they were getting closer and closer to my house. Something stirred inside me. I felt like if I didn't do something now, I wouldn't be able to get out of this. I pulled away from the window, checked the doors and windows again, but I couldn't do anything. I couldn't find a way out. I couldn't find an answer. The lights were getting closer. I felt my heart beat faster. Suddenly, the air became even thicker, even darker. The feeling became so strong that it seemed like the forest itself was trying to swallow me. But what scares me the most is that I can't remember how long they've been coming towards me. Maybe it started a few days ago when I first saw this well, or maybe they've always been here, and I just didn't know. The morning brought not so much relief as more questions. I woke up with a strange feeling of anxiety that had not left me since I returned home. I could not shake the feeling that everything that had happened in the last few days was not just a coincidence. It was like a continuation of some incomplete nightmare that did not want to end. I did not know how many times I turned over in bed, trying to forget, but I did not succeed. As soon as I saw them, a cold chill ran down my spine. The same moss I'd seen on the well's stonework was now here, on my back porch. I didn't need to look at my watch to know that these marks weren't made by the kind of people who make them in everyday life. These marks, they weren't just strange, they were dangerous. I stood by the window trying to figure out what to do. How could I not have noticed them before? Why hadn't I heard anyone approaching? And what the hell was going on with that moss? Why was it so dark and unnatural? Why were those tracks moving away from the forest, not into the forest? The anxiety began to turn into panic. My mind couldn't calm down. I decided to go outside, check the tracks, try to understand what exactly was happening. Maybe it was just a random animal, something I could explain, but something told me it wasn't. I walked to the door, holding the knife I always kept in case of need. As ridiculous as it seemed, everything had felt fishy these past few days. The way the air around me felt, the way everything was too quiet, too empty. As I stepped out onto the porch, I immediately felt a chill that wasn't just from the winter chill, but from something else. It was something more sinister, something that made every cell in my body feel like I wasn't in my home, but somewhere else, in a world where the rules weren't as I knew them. The tracks led me around the backyard, towards the woods. I didn't know what scared me more, the tracks themselves, or the fact that I was just seeing them now. It was too late, and I could feel the dark forces I had sensed before coming back, like they were reaching out to my house, filling every corner with this overwhelming sense of dread. When I reached the edge of the forest, my legs began to tremble treacherously, and I realized that I could not go any further. Every tree, every bush seemed alive to me, as if they were beginning to hide something, something terrible that should remain invisible. I heard something rustling in the dark branches of the trees. Maybe it was just the wind, but at that moment it seemed to me that I heard breathing. Holding my breath, I stepped back, continuing to watch the strange tracks. I felt the weight of the invisible threat growing even greater. Fear filled me, and at one point I thought I needed to go back into the house and lock all the doors. But when I turned to go back, I suddenly noticed that I was not alone. I looked at the forest. Its dark, unclear outlines seemed even more threatening than before. But something else appeared in this dark space. Small glowing dots, the same as those I had seen through the window at night, began to appear between the trees. They moved just as before, quickly, chaotically, as if they were some kind of creatures that could not stay in one place for long. A huge feeling of terror came over me. I couldn't stand here any longer. I needed to get back into the house, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I felt trapped again. I was on the verge of panic, and at that moment I heard that whisper again. That same whisper that I couldn't understand, but that continued to haunt me. "You can't leave. We're already here." I turned as if something had compelled me to do so, and I saw something that made my heart stop. The shadows between the trees began to move, but they were not just shadows. I saw silhouettes, low, distorted figures that seemed to be part of the forest, part of something dark. They moved with incredible speed, and I knew they were close. I ran without thinking, without paying attention to the tracks. I ran until I crashed into the wall of the house. Almost exhausted, I locked the door behind me and again felt that heavy air filling the space. I caught my breath. Why did I have to leave? Why did I do this? All I had to do was stay put, but now they were here. And from what I could tell, they weren't going to leave. When I returned to the house, I seemed to still hear footsteps outside the windows. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Strangely, this silence now seemed unnatural, as if the forest itself had frozen in anticipation of something. This feeling grew as I stood by the door trying to calm down. But the more I tried to ignore what was happening, the more I felt everything around me becoming not my own. My strength was leaving me. But despite this, I could not relax. I decided that I would still be on guard, to watch what was happening, because right now I needed to be attentive. But something in this house suddenly changed, as if it became more cramped. The darkness thickened in the corners, and I felt how the walls were gradually shrinking around me. At some point, I realized that this was not just a panicked game of my mind. This was real. I headed for the kitchen, hoping that something familiar, like cooking or even the sound of running water, would help me come to my senses. But as soon as I got to the sink, I saw it. Wet footprints running across the floor. Not from my footsteps, not from the rain. These footprints were damp, covered in black moss, and they led straight into the hallway to my office. My heart was pounding harder, and I couldn't figure out where they could have come from. These footprints couldn't have been made by someone alive. They were like the ones on the porch. I walked up to the office door, and with every step I took, it became harder and harder to breathe. I felt something tightening in my chest, and a nasty certainty crept into me that I shouldn't open that door. But I needed to understand what was happening. I couldn't afford to remain in the dark, not knowing what was hiding behind that door at that moment. I opened it. What I saw took me by surprise. In the corner, right next to the books, lay one of those strange figures I had seen in the forest at night. It was small, no more than a meter tall, with twisted black limbs, as if old tree roots were growing on it. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I immediately realized that it was alive, at least in the sense that it was perhaps a living creature created by this damn forest. She stood still, like a statue, but I knew it wasn't a statue. It was something watching me, maybe waiting for me to make my next move. Thoughts swirled in my head, but one of them was practically screaming in panic, "Go away!" I stepped back, but suddenly there was a flash of light on the floor. I noticed something shiny lying next to the figure. I reached down, carefully but quickly picked it up. It was my phone. How? How did it get here? I was sure I had left it on the table in my room the last time I ran out of the house. I felt the blood drain from my face. I squeezed my eyes shut again, because I knew someone was using my phone. This strange shadow, this creature, it wasn't just watching me, it knew everything. It even knew I was trying to hide. At that moment, I heard that voice, that damned whisper that had been haunting me for the past week. It came from right behind me, and this time I couldn't avoid it. It was like a cold hand on my shoulder. "You're not alone. We're already inside." I froze, unable to move. My body began to panic. I had heard that voice too many times, and I still couldn't get used to the fact that it was coming from me. It was my voice, but not the one I heard. It was distorted. There was a darkness to it, as if something inhuman had taken up residence inside. I turned and saw what was standing next to the door. The shadow was now more distinct. Many small eyes on her body began to glow like stars. Something was moving on her body, like tree roots growing into the ground. I ran like never before. I ran into the corridor, slammed the door, and found myself back in the hall. My breathing was ragged and my heart was pounding like it was about to burst out. Looking around, I saw that a new inscription had appeared on the floor next to the bed. It was written with the same moss, the same dark substance that I had seen in the forest and on the well. This time, the inscription was much longer than the last time. "You're getting closer. We'll find you." I couldn't ignore it. These creatures, they were already here. I couldn't even think that I would be safe until I pulled out the roots that were clinging to my life. I had to find a way to stop them, once and for all. But to do that, I had to understand what they wanted, what they were looking for. Because it seemed like they weren't just following me, they knew me. They knew my house. And that wasn't a coincidence. And now, no matter what I did, I had to be prepared for the worst. When I woke up, the feeling of oppressive anxiety was even stronger than before. Yesterday's events did not leave me like an unbearable weight hanging in the air. My mind tried to find order, but each attempt only deepened the internal chaos. It seemed that I began to lose touch with reality. This place, this house, everything that was happening around, they began to coexist into one nightmarish monolith, and I did not know how to fight it. I got out of bed, unable to lie there for long. There was a rustling sound again, the same one I had heard a few days ago, like something was moving in the house. But this time, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I wasn't alone. As I approached the window, I noticed that the forest looked unusual. It wasn't as clear as it usually was in the morning. Everything was foggy, like in some other alien reality. For a moment, I thought it was just another symptom of stress, but I intuitively felt that something was wrong with this forest. It was as if it was watching me, as if it was there, in another dimension, and pulling me into its depths. I heard a faint but distinct sound, like someone quietly knocking on the door. It was no ordinary knock, but something more ominous than any noise I might have expected. Almost unconsciously, I walked toward the door. Every cell in my body screamed at me not to open it, to just stand in the corner and freeze. But something made me move forward. I opened the door. There was only a shadow in front of me, tall, black, almost indistinct. I knew it was more than just the absence of light. It was something waiting, like some kind of catastrophe was about to happen, something big and imminent. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I felt like it wasn't just there. It was searching. And I was sure it was searching for me, but what could be standing in front of me? Why did I feel like this thing knew me? Like it had been watching me for years. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the threshold. Its face was as dark as the night itself, but its eyes, small, with thin red stripes, looked straight at me. I felt a chill creeping over my body, but I couldn't look away. Those eyes, they made me believe in the impossible. And yet it was more than just a sight. It was a feeling that someone or something had been watching me for a long time. And now finally it had come to take what was supposed to be its... "You saw us," the voice said. But it was no ordinary human voice. It was a whisper mingling with echoes, as if several voices were speaking at once, merging into one viscous, icy entity. I couldn't look away. Every muscle in my body was tense. Every nerve was clenched. Fear dug into me. I didn't have the strength to respond. I didn't know how to react to what stood before me. "You were called here," the voice continued, and in those words I felt not just a threat, but something else, an unimaginable emptiness, something that filled the space beyond the door. It became hard to breathe, and even the air that had seemed fresh a few minutes ago was now thick, thick. I took a step back. This figure, it wasn't just part of the forest. It was part of something I couldn't comprehend. It was part of my destiny, one I had been trying to avoid, and now I realized that there was no avoiding it. I took another step back, but the shadow moved toward me almost in time with my movements. Suddenly I realized that I couldn't just leave. I couldn't run away no matter how much I wanted to. My head was full of thoughts, but they couldn't focus. I knew one thing. I was on the brink of something important, And now with that figure standing so close, I knew I had to look straight into its eyes. I had to face that horror. It was the only way to understand what was coming. I looked up and met her gaze, and as soon as it happened, the world around me seemed to fall apart. I felt like my legs refused to support me. Everything began to shift. The space began to change. I was not in this house, not in this place. I was in another one, where everything was dark, lifeless, and the air was like a liquid in which I found it difficult to breathe. You can't go back. You will remain here, in the shadows. We are always here, the voice echoed in my head, filling every thought. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran, not caring what I was leaving behind. I needed to find a way out, but what was following me couldn't be killed by just running. It was something ancient, something that hadn't gone away, hadn't disappeared. It wasn't just an ominous memory, it was real, and I was right in the middle of it. I spent the entire day avoiding thoughts about what had happened the night before. My mind refused to accept it, as if trying to protect me from the terrible reality I had found myself in. But I knew that I could no longer hide the truth. It was everywhere, in the air, in every step, in every rustle, even in my reflection in the mirror, where I had become a stranger. I was not myself. It was impossible not to notice. I didn't go. I sat on the couch trying to convince myself that this was just panic, but I had a hard time dealing with this feeling that I was here, not alone. Something was watching me. I didn't know who or what it was, but every moment I was sure that if I looked back, I would see it right behind me. At this point, I seemed to begin to lose my sense of self, to forget where I ended and it, whatever it was, began. When the clock on the wall struck 3:17, I no longer expected anything good. I knew it was no coincidence. And again, as always, the phone rang, my own number on the phone screen. My heart began to pound in my throat again. I was silent, unable to respond. I just sat there watching the screen, and I knew I couldn't run. I couldn't hide. The ringing stopped, but it didn't go away. It was like an eclipse. Suddenly, the light in the room became dim, as if the sun had suddenly disappeared at some point. The air became thick, heavy, as if many invisible beings had gathered in the room, waiting for the moment. And then I heard them again, the footsteps, the sound that seemed so familiar, the same footsteps I had heard a few days ago when I noticed wet footprints on the back porch. They were closer now. The steps were clear, measured, as if someone was simply moving in my direction. There was no stopping them, and I was sure they knew where I was. I approached the door cautiously, listening. Everything was so quiet that even my own breath seemed loud. I crept to the window and peered outside, hoping to see something that might explain what was happening. The forest seemed familiar, but as soon as I looked at it, I knew I was in the wrong place. It was different, as if all those trees, all those shadows were subject to someone else's will. Then I noticed them. They weren't just shadows. I couldn't figure out what I was seeing, but they were moving through the trees like ghosts, not touching the ground. These entities were part of the forest, and they moved with some incredible precision, in unison, as if they had their own goal, their own plan. I felt like every step they took brought them closer to me, and it seemed to me that they knew where I was too. At that moment, I realized they were coming for me. I was not just a target for them. I was part of their plan, and I couldn't stay here any longer. I made up my mind. My strength was leaving me, but I knew that if I didn't take a step now, they would find me anyway, and it would be too late. I gathered everything I could and headed for the exit, but at that very second I noticed that the door was open. Not the way I had left it. It was open a few inches. I felt the silence become deafening. My heart was pounding in my ears. I took a step forward, ready to see what was beyond the door, but before I could, something heavy, unimaginable, loomed over me. I felt the air change, like something from the shadows was beginning to coalesce into a living thing, writhing around me. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. Then I turned around, and for the first time in days, I saw what should have been obvious. I was facing something I couldn't understand. Not just fear. It was something so much more than I could have expected. And in that moment, I knew they weren't just here. They were already inside. I felt nothing anymore. No fear, no pain, just emptiness. As if everything around me had lost its shape, and I found myself in the center of an unknown space where time and space no longer existed. Just the feeling that I was not alone. It was not loneliness. It was the feeling that something alien, hostile, but at the same time complete, had penetrated me and I became part of it. I stood in the doorway and the shadows kept moving around me. It was impossible to tell what it was. There was no clarity or certainty in the world I was in. Everything was at once familiar and alien. I felt something crawling along the walls of my consciousness, breaking it down, as if someone was trying to take me apart. And that's when I realized that maybe I was gone. With each step, they came closer. I couldn't hear their footsteps, but I felt their presence in the air. These creatures, their shadows, their eyes, all of it became part of my world. I became part of their world. And the more I thought about it, the less connected I felt to myself. I wasn't this man who once lived in this house. I was something else, something much older and more powerful than man. I tried to resist, tried to fight the feeling, but it was too strong. Just as I tried to understand what was happening, I saw their eyes again. There was nothing human about them. This was something else entirely. Creatures that were and were not real, that existed only within the boundaries of my weak, crumbling reality. Eyes that looked at me and saw everything that was and everything that would be. Eyes that did not simply observe, but penetrated me, forcing me to become a part of their existence. I realized that this was not the end. This was the beginning of something greater, something ancient, something hostile and inescapable, that stood beyond the well and the shadow in the forest. They were not just hunters. They were older than everything I knew of the world, and their plan was not finished. I was just a link in the chain, part of something greater, more sinister than I could understand. I didn't know what to do. My attempts to escape had ended in failure. My home, my life, all of it had become part of their world. I was trapped, unable to escape or fight. I tried to find a way out, but every movement only took me deeper into this abyss. At that moment, I felt my legs begin to tremble. I could no longer stand, and at that moment, when I fell, everything around me began to disappear. But not the darkness, not the emptiness. It was something else. I couldn't explain what it was, but I knew it was what I was looking for, what they were waiting for. I didn't know what happened to those eyes in the well. I didn't know how I ended up here. At some point, I felt my gaze losing focus, being taken away into the unknown, and I realized that I was no longer in the place where it all began. I was not in my home. I was not in the forest. I was inside their world. My vision blurred, and I felt myself being pulled by something, invisible but strong, like a magnet pulling me out of my body. I couldn't resist, and then, before it all disappeared, I felt myself becoming part of something else, something much bigger than I could understand. The sound of footsteps, they grew quieter. And then they were gone. My world was swallowed up. Story 2. Flowers bloomed today. It was so unexpected that I didn't even immediately understand what was happening. I remembered how I woke up this morning. Ordinary. Nothing out of the ordinary. But when I went outside, it became clear to me that everything had changed. Everything around the house was filled with flowers that weren't there before. I looked at them, and with each glance, it became more and more difficult for me to understand why they frightened me so much. The flowers were enormous, blooming in unimaginable hues that I couldn't recognize. It was as if nature had decided to reveal some hidden kaleidoscope of colors to me. It wasn't just a collection of the usual hues that I had always been familiar with. These colors were so bright and saturated that I felt as if I had no right to see them. I tried to discern what was in front of me, and every touch of my gaze made me dizzy. Blues, reds, yellows, pinks, and dozens of other hues that I didn't even know what to call them danced smoothly against the bright green. The wind swayed them, and it looked like the sea against the horizon, where the sky smoothly merged into the land, and the land into the sky. I stood there, lost in these patterns as if enchanted, forgetting about time, forgetting about everything. The blades of grass that twined around the stems seemed alive, as if they were moving in time with the wind. I saw them wriggling, as if they were calling me, inviting me to follow them into the depths of this strange, beautiful world. I continued to watch, and at some point I realized that I was losing the sense of time. I felt my body starting to get lost in this ocean of colors. Minutes or hours or something else had passed. It was hard to say. I had lost all touch with reality. All I knew was that they were there, and that there were more of them than I could comprehend. My head was overflowing with thoughts, but each of them was starting to blur and disappear in this wonderful kaleidoscope. I didn't know how much time had passed when I finally turned away. Why did I do that? Why did I suddenly feel this strange chill in my chest? It was as if someone had called out to me, but I couldn't hear them. My gaze slid quickly around the house, and then I noticed that something was wrong. I glanced at my watch. 35 minutes, no more, but it felt like much more time. I glanced at the open door leading to the hallway and realized that I had let them in. The whole time I was absorbed in those flowers, the door had been open, meaning that everything I had seen could become part of something else. I moved slowly as if hesitating toward the hallway. The dark, cool air in the house could not obscure this strange, unsettling chill in my chest. I felt my legs growing heavy. Had I really just been standing there this whole time, motionless, not understanding? The hallway was quiet, too quiet. The sounds in the house had long since disappeared, and only my footsteps echoed off the cold walls. It was a strange sound, so quiet and dark that it seemed as if it was not mine. I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was moving, watching, observing. Suddenly it became clear to me that these were not just flowers. This could not be just a natural phenomenon. I walked up to my son's bedroom door, and as my eyes focused on the handle, I felt everything around me begin to pulse. The anxiety in my chest grew stronger, and my breathing became labored. My hands grew sweaty as I placed them on the cold metal of the door handle. That's when I stopped. Fear gripped me, and I closed my eyes. I couldn't decide what to do next, but I couldn't back out. I had to go in, see. Maybe it wasn't as scary as it seemed. Maybe it was all just my imagination. But some voice inside me was screaming that I was wrong. I opened my eyes. The room was dark, and the only light that fell on the floor was dim and distorted, as if this world had suddenly become a painting, blurry and unreal. I turned the handle and the door creaked. My heart jumped as I stepped inside. What I saw I will never forget. My son was there, but it wasn't what I expected to see. He was wrapped in what looked like a web. It was hard to believe, but it looked like a web, hanging from the ceiling. He was probably half his normal size. His body seemed compressed, almost like a pile of bones surrounded by this strange substance. And then I realized, wait, it wasn't just a web. It was part of something bigger. He was consumed. He was part of something I couldn't understand. This thing, it was writhing around my son. I could see its body intertwined with numerous tentacles and legs that seemed to pulse and twist. They surrounded him, and I felt panic rising in me. I saw his body barely moving, and numerous proboscises were reaching around him, consuming him. My son, he couldn't be here. This couldn't be real, but it was all too real to be just a nightmare. This creature, it was part of this world. I couldn't understand who it was, where it came from, or what it wanted. But I knew one thing, I couldn't leave my son in this. I couldn't just watch him disappear. And no matter how hard I tried, I knew that something much worse than I could have imagined was starting. Through my closed eyes, I felt my hand grip the doorknob so tightly that it felt like it was going to snap off. Everything inside me was furious, and yet so confused. I didn't know how to act, what to think. My son, he was right there, but he wasn't there. What I saw couldn't be real. I had to do something, but what? My body felt heavy, as if each step cost my entire life. I stepped away from the door, looking down at the floor. My hand was shaking, and in my head there was only one thought. I have to act. I couldn't stand there and watch everything disappear into oblivion. Everything I had once known was disappearing before me, like an old house crumbling from old age. I knew that if I didn't do something now, I could lose everything. My family, my home, everything I thought was mine, might not be mine anymore. Panicking, I looked at my watch. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, as if it had been distorted by this strange phenomenon. 35 minutes, it said, but it seemed as if I had been here forever. As soon as I took a few steps back into the hallway, a flood of thoughts engulfed me, like a storm gathering strength. I no longer remembered how long I had been standing in front of the door, watching what was happening inside. But something was wrong. The flowers, these strange, bright, terrifyingly beautiful flowers that had been circling around my house all this time, as if waiting for something to attack. But how could I not have noticed that they were dangerous? I saw them touch the ground, how they began to sprout and send out long, twisting stems, filling the space. I saw them move as if they were alive themselves. At first I thought it was just some kind of joke of nature, a play of light and shadow, but now I knew that was a mistake. Flowers couldn't be like that. I saw their petals slowly open, like something supernatural reaching for the light. But what scared me most was that I didn't know how to deal with it. When I returned to the living room, my eyes still couldn't get used to the bright colors, which now seemed even more intense than before. It wasn't just a gentle glow. No, it was something more. It was like an unknown force that was pulling and beckoning me to do things I would never do. These flowers, these monsters, these creatures, all of it seemed part of something more dangerous than I could have imagined. I clenched my teeth, trying desperately to focus. My family, they were here, in this house. My wife, my son. I couldn't leave them. I had to protect them. But how? What could I do against these creatures? Memories of reading stories about supernatural creatures, myths, and legends. Creatures that hypnotize people into letting them into their homes flooded my mind. This couldn't be a coincidence. I knew I was dealing with something I hadn't expected. Oh, how naive I had been to think that such a thing could just be a fantasy. Everything suddenly went dark, and I thought of my wife again. Where was she? Where had she been all these minutes? I knew she couldn't be that far away. Maybe she was at the other end of the house. Maybe she'd been trying to find shelter all this time. But did she know? Did she see what was happening? I had to find her. I had to make sure she was safe. My footsteps sounded hollow in the empty corridors, but each step was like a fight with an invisible enemy. Everything around was unnaturally quiet. I stood for a moment in one place, listening to the sounds. Nothing. Emptiness. I knew that somewhere in this house there was a hidden threat, and I could not stay here without action. I felt the ground beneath my feet grow cold. It was not just a feeling, it was an obsession. I looked around. Everything seemed the same, but something in the air was changed. Some invisible force, as if the space itself was changing around me. I stopped and took a deep breath. My gaze fell on the window, where I could see the flowers growing and growing, as if they were swallowing up the world around them. Ahead, on the horizon, a dark shape began. One that seemed to have always been there. But now as I peered at it, it became much clearer, much more ominous. I knew I had to act. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to stop it. Time was pulling me back, but I was ready to move forward, despite the fear. A solution had to be found. But what would that solution be? Where was it hidden, and what should I do? I knew that the future I knew no longer existed. I was on the brink, and perhaps it was already too late to change anything. But despite this, I knew one thing. I couldn't just sit and wait. I had to fight. As I rounded the corner and entered the kitchen, I was struck by this strange, inexplicable smell. It was not pungent like the smell of rot, but its presence was in the air, impossible to ignore. I looked at the table, and my heart sank. It was not just a table, it was a stage. There was a plate on the table with the remains of food, but around it were such strange, bright traces. They were the same colors I had seen in the garden when the flowers began to bloom. These blues, bright reds, and purples seemed alive, as if drying up everything around them, sucking out their strength. Trying to ignore the oddities, I went to the window. The sky was covered with gray clouds, but there was nothing ordinary about this darkness. Ordinary clouds contain rain, thunder, change. But here there was no rain, no change, only dark masses, slowly stretching toward the horizon. Not long ago, I remembered how stars sometimes shone in this sky, how the sun glided calmly across the heavens. But now the sky seemed alien, as if someone had torn it out of place. I looked around and realized I couldn't be alone. I wanted to go to her, to my wife, and just make sure she was safe. I knew she could be there, but everything around me felt so alien that I couldn't feel her presence. It was unbearable. I had to find her. Looking into the bedroom, I felt something in the air squeezing my chest. I followed the sound, that strange melody that echoed from the hallway. Sounds that couldn't be ignored, but not exactly music, no. It was something more, something that broke my thoughts, that pulled them out of my head. It was like an endless echo that never stopped. I stepped into the corridor and saw her right away. She was standing by the window, her face turned towards the side where I saw the strange red flowers continuing to grow. There was nothing alive in her eyes. Everything was as if under a veil of fog. It was so unnatural that I didn't even immediately understand how to approach her. I had to say something, do something, but I couldn't find the words. My steps were quiet, but something like panic was pounding in my chest. With every movement I made, I felt my muscles tighten, as if even the air was resisting me, preventing me from moving. I stood next to her, not knowing how to get her back. I remembered sitting in this house, living here for years. It was filled with laughter, the noise of life. We made plans, sought solace in each other, but now I stood next to her, and it felt like she was different. How had I not noticed it before? How could I have missed the moment when she began to change? I felt her coldness without even touching her skin. It felt like she was far away, too far away, like there was a chasm between us. Do you hear that? Her voice was not like before, but like someone else's. It was weak, as if it had been sucked out of her. I didn't know how to answer. I knew she wasn't talking about what I'd heard. She hadn't heard what I'd heard. She hadn't seen what I'd seen. These flowers, these creatures, sprouting in every corner of this house. She couldn't understand. I took her hand and felt her move away from me. Not physically, no, but somehow inside herself, as if she was no longer here, as if she was part of this strange obscurantism that reigned around. And suddenly, in that moment, I understood. This was not an accident. This was all part of something bigger. These were not just flowers. These were not just creatures. Whatever they might be, they came with a purpose, and what was happening to us, it was not an accident. I didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear. I couldn't leave her like this. I couldn't leave myself. I had to find a way to escape this nightmare, and maybe find some answers. Answers to the questions that had been unanswered all this time. In the dark corner of the room, with those horrible flowers flickering, I felt fear creeping up on me. And I knew one thing: we were not alone. The darkness that had seemed eternal finally gave way to a faint light that filtered through the narrow gaps in the curtains. I stood at the threshold, unsure of where to go next. This place, it still existed, but not as I knew it. The whole familiar environment, my home, the place where we had built our lives, now felt alien, filled with obscurantism and strange changes that I could not understand. I looked around, and the sense of unease only grew stronger. Flowers continued to grow in the streets as never before, their vibrant hues seeming to fill the space, breaking down familiar boundaries. When I looked out the window, I saw their stems bending and reaching toward the house, as if they were trying to enter, to grasp, to devour. This was not just an exaggeration. They were looking for us. I huddled in a corner, trying to pull my thoughts out of this obsessive cycle. The signs of change were not local. They were all-encompassing. The house and everything in it were disappearing into shadow, as if the space itself was beginning to crumble under the influence of something external, some inexplicable influence. The sky no longer seemed normal. There was something strange on the horizon, like a shadow obscuring the truth. I could no longer explain what was happening. I felt like everything we knew was an illusion. My head was filled with sounds I couldn't make out. A cicada-like noise echoed through the house, as if nature itself was screaming at the intrusion of these creatures. I looked back at my wife. She stood there like a statue, looking out the window, but her eyes weren't her eyes. It was terrifying. I tried to walk over, hoping that her gaze would meet mine, that I could bring her back to us. But there was no reaction. Her body was there, but her soul was somewhere far away. I didn't know how much time had passed since I saw her in this state. Minutes? Hours? I couldn't tell. I closed my eyes and tried to focus. There was too much going on around me, and I needed to get myself together. Suddenly, I felt cold, a slight chill, but a chill that went right to my bones. It was coming from the door to the hallway, the same one where I had seen the terrible footprints left by those who had crawled through the house. I felt that strange, unfamiliar weight on my chest again. It was the same feeling I had when I first realized that something was wrong. Everything was foreign. My mind searched for a way out, but found no solution. I closed my eyes, and for a moment it seemed to me that I was back in the garden, among those flowers. But now they looked different. Everything around them was distorted, like a painting by a mad artist. The petals danced unnaturally, shifting and bending into strange shapes. The colors I saw now seemed much brighter, as if everything was done not to enjoy, but to distract, to entice. I shuddered. It was too much. I opened my eyes and saw my wife again. She hadn't moved, but next to her, I saw something I couldn't understand. It was in her movements, in her breathing that wasn't hers. It was something alien, lurking in her gaze, in her body. A strange shadow crawling across her skin, as if it were part of what was happening around her. I realized she was one of them. "Don't give in," my head screamed, but the words wouldn't come out. It was all so familiar and yet so foreign. I tried to find the strength to push away all my fears, but then I was overcome with a sense of despair, as if time was literally slipping through my fingers. I stepped away from my wife, feeling the ground beneath my fingernails grow shaky. Towards the kitchen exit, in the corner, I noticed something, or was it something? Blurry shapes crawling along the floor. Invisible, but impossible not to feel. Something slithering in the dark corners, something that was watching. I lacked the strength to understand what, but I knew it was there, and it was waiting. I was just part of this nightmare, part of something bigger. Without thinking, I opened the door to the street. I was immediately hit in the face by this strange, piercing smell. It was already familiar, but now it was unbearable. It was like the smell of rot, like the smell of something dead, mixed with something alive and sinister. It was slippery, damp, as if the air itself wanted to pull me into the unknown. I ran outside trying to swallow the horror. I knew I couldn't run from it. I knew I couldn't escape the terrible reality that surrounded us. This world, this spring, these flowers, this shadow, everything was part of something we couldn't understand. The sky changed again, and I knew I was no longer alone. I didn't know how much time had passed since I had run out into the street, but the feeling that everything around me was gradually collapsing did not leave me. I stood there, as if in a daze, looking at this world that became stranger with each new glance. The street seemed empty, but nothing was as it should be. Flowers continued to bloom, growing into the asphalt, stretching their roots to the sides, as if they were trying to penetrate the earth itself. The smell was unbearable. I tried to breathe, but this feeling, as if each breath swallowed your soul, did not go away. I moved a little to the side, trying to hide from this eerie light that enveloped every corner. This was not just spring, it was a curse, something that had awakened and was now mercilessly destroying everything in its path. And then I heard them. Whispers, quiet, subtle, as if they were hidden in the very fabric of the air. They weren't words. No. It was like eavesdropping on something happening at the heart of the world. I froze, trying to figure out where they were coming from. But the more I listened, the more it seemed to me that they were coming not from the air, but from the earth itself, from beneath the surface. It's not just them, the thought ran through my head. My eyes darted around the house, around the empty streets, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all one big experiment, and we were maybe just a part of it. I stepped toward the house next door, which looked like all the others, but something about it was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was an old house that had clearly seen better days, but that was it. As I approached the door, the feeling of unease grew. Suddenly, the threat that I knew there was something strange about this house began to materialize. I walked in. It was dark inside. The slightly musty smell was familiar, but something about it also seemed unnatural. A noise seemingly from another room caught my attention. I didn't know what to expect, but the footsteps were leading me somewhere I wasn't prepared to be. There in the back, in the corner of the room, stood a small figure, its face hidden in the darkness. The whispers filled the air again, and now they sounded much clearer than before. It was something familiar, and yet alien. I froze and tried to focus. What is this? What is happening to us? The question that did not leave me, but I could not find an answer. Then the figure stepped forward. I saw her face, familiar, but not what I knew. Her eyes were full of something different. It wasn't just a tired face. It was a face that reflected everything that had happened to us, distorted and shattered. She held out her hand. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't her, but then it was her. Just a shell, distorted, but still recognizable. And in her eyes was the same look I'd seen in my wife's. It was what I'd feared, what I'd hoped not to see. The whispers were growing louder. The ground beneath my fingernails seemed to shift, the sounds from beneath the floor growing insistent. Everything was pulsing. She stepped forward again. I took a step back, but something in this place held me. I couldn't just walk away. We were connected, and I knew it all too well. I had to get through this. I had to understand what was happening. Do you hear them? Her voice was strange, as if there was something alien in it. It was not her voice. It was a voice that sounded with a distorted reality, a voice that flowed from the shadows themselves. I began to back away, not knowing what to do, but my legs did not obey me. My mind screamed, but my body moved of its own accord, as if it was already lost. She walked behind me, her eyes following my every move. I turned, and suddenly something in the house began to ring. I turned around, and there they were, the creatures starting to appear, crawling out of cracks, out of empty corners, like parts of this world, breaking through the fabric of reality. This was not just a nightmare. This was something more. Tentacles, fragile and black, grew out of the walls like roots, like flowers. Only they were sinister and deadly. I felt the walls begin to close in on me. I was alone, but not quite. And the world around me, it was not the same. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they were getting closer. I woke up with a strange heaviness in the air, as if reality itself was beginning to warp. My eyes hadn't adjusted to the darkness yet, but I knew I was in my room, or so I thought. The air was thick, as if I was breathing not just oxygen, but something heavy that made me feel like every cell in my body was protesting. Bowing my head, I tried to take in some normal air, to regain some sense of normalcy, but it wouldn't come. The walls of the room, now dimly glowing, seemed translucent, as if I was inside a giant bubble. I got out of bed, every step echoing, as if I was moving through empty space. I knew that everything was wrong, but I lacked the strength to understand what exactly. I wasn't sure if I was in reality or if this was all a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My mind was overloaded, and I started moving around the house trying to find something that could explain what was happening. Doors, windows, they were in the same place where they should have been, but they were not part of this world. A feeling of déjà vu was washing over me. It was as if everything around me was a mirror, but a mirror that reflected not my movements, but something else. Shadows that should not exist. creatures that should not be here. It was all like an invisible border that squeezed the space, not allowing me to escape. I reached the window and saw that the world outside had become completely different. Everything seemed alive, but somehow impossibly dead at the same time. The flowers continued to grow, but they were no longer just flowers. They were monsters. Their leaves trembled in the air, their stems bent at strange angles as if they were trying to take control of the world around them. Everything was in motion, but the movement was not natural. It was alien, as if the earth itself was trying to fight this foreign invasion. I saw people, or what had once been people. Their faces were distorted, they walked slowly, almost mechanically, as if there was no soul in their movements. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the darkness. It seemed as if sounds here had no meaning, as if this was a world where rules did not exist. I looked at my hands again. They felt foreign, as if I were looking at them through someone else's eyes. But they were mine, or so I thought. I couldn't tell where I ended and where the world began. It seemed like there were no boundaries between us anymore. Everything around me was becoming liquid, viscous, as if space and time were blurring. I tried to focus, trying to understand what was happening, but I couldn't. My mind was empty, as if each moment had been replaced by something new that I couldn't process. As I moved away from the window, I noticed that the entire room acted as if it had no place in this world. The floor was slippery, and I felt my steps going into the void, as if I were stepping over an invisible line. Suddenly I heard it. No, not it. It was something else, something that was part of this void, part of this whole strange world. Whispers quiet as the rustling of grass, but they were in my head. They did not come from outside, but came straight from my consciousness. My thoughts were racing. I felt like they were being squeezed, forcing me to follow them. I had to follow. I had to understand. The whispers in my head were growing louder, more distinct. "You are not alone," the voice said. And in that moment I realized it wasn't mine. It was an alien consciousness, alien thoughts, an alien presence. It wasn't a person, it was more. It was something from another world, another reality. I took a step back and felt the entire atmosphere around me compressing again. The walls, the air, the space, everything began to blur. I found myself in the middle of this bubble, unsure of what to do. What was I supposed to do? Hide? I tried to remember what could save me, but my memory was fading, as if I was being stripped of extra time, torn apart. Suddenly I saw a figure. It stood in the doorway, still as a statue. I felt it compress the air around me. Its presence felt like an invisible threat. I froze, trying to figure out who it was, but it didn't move. It was something with empty eyes, a face I couldn't make out. I heard the whispers again. They filled my mind. They haunted me. All my thoughts gravitated toward one thing. They are here. They are among us. And perhaps it was more than just a threat. It was the beginning of the end, and it had already begun. I woke up this morning with a strange feeling, as if I didn't quite know where I was. The room around me was familiar, but everything seemed foreign, distorted. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing. The world I knew no longer existed. It had changed, and we all had changed with it. The house was silent, but this silence was not calm. It was heavy, as if every object in this house was trying to free itself from some invisible force that was holding it back. I got out of bed, but my legs were weak. I needed to go somewhere, to figure out what to do next. I peered out the window, but the world beyond was not the same. Everything was different. The flowers, the very ones that had only recently been simple plants, now resembled something alien, terrible, distorted. They shrank like thunderclouds, their stems bent as if some invisible hand were moving them, and the flowers began to change their shapes, turning into something completely different, and every movement of these creatures echoed in the air, like a cold shudder. I knew I had to leave the house. There was no other choice. I couldn't stay here, in this nightmare. My son, I didn't know what was wrong with him, but his absence scared me more than the threat itself. All I could do was try to find him, at least try to save him. I opened the door and stepped into the dark hallway. Every step echoed in the emptiness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept moving, but the further I went, the stranger it became. The walls weren't just changing. They seemed to be pulsating. They responded to my presence, as if I was disturbing their peace. The walls seemed alive. I thought it was just my imagination, but the more I tried to think of something normal, the more I felt that it wasn't just my imagination. My steps led me to my son's bedroom door. It was open. I stopped in front of it, my heart pounding. I knew what I would find there would be terrible, but I needed to see it. I needed to understand what was happening. I stepped through the threshold into the room. My hand froze on the doorknob. What I saw shocked me so much that I couldn't move. On the bed, in the shreds of the blanket, lay my son. But it wasn't what I expected. He was different. His body was covered in strange appendages, from which thin, hard tentacles jutted out, digging into the mattress. His face, once innocent, was now distorted, as if it had become a part of something larger than himself. His eyes were empty, non-existent. There was no life in his gaze, only a dark emptiness that consumed everything around him. I took a step back, feeling everything inside me crumble. It was too much. It was more than I could comprehend. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fight it, how to defeat these creatures, these monsters that had taken my family, my son, everything I held dear. I grabbed my head, trying to find a solution, but instead I heard whispers. They were everywhere, in my head, in the air, in my soul. You can't defeat them. You can't save him. The words sounded so clear, as if they were a part of me, a part of this world. But suddenly I understood. I understood that this was not the end. This was not a decisive defeat. I could resist. I could try to fight. And at that moment when I was about to give up, I felt a faint spark of hope. This was my last chance. I had to make a choice. I took one last look at my son, and I knew that if I didn't take hold of him, if I didn't find the strength to fight, I would lose everything. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let these creatures take my life, my family. I had to find a way to take back control. Even if it meant fighting something I couldn't understand, I couldn't stand by. I turned ready to find a way out of this labyrinth, and I stepped into the darkness, knowing the horrors that lay ahead. But I also knew one thing. I would not give up. All I could do was fight until the end, because I was ready. Story 3. When you left, the world became easier. Not right away, of course, not in an instant. But gradually, with each passing day, I felt invisible shackles being lifted from me. Those shackles that kept me in constant tension, in anxiety, in fear that I would not cope, that I would not get out. My depression, like a thick fog, slowly dissipated, and I began to breathe. It was like a long, painful awakening after an endless night. I no longer woke up with the feeling that the world would collapse on me at any second, that I would again be running from something invisible. Your at my cycle. I didn't my energy, but now. So when you were a master manipulator, I thought you loved me. You told me over and over how much you valued me, how much you needed me. You used words to confuse me, to make me believe that I couldn't survive without you. You made me feel like I couldn't survive without your support, even when it wasn't support. It was a pretense. You said you loved me, but your love was twisted, full of expectations, fear, and control. At first, I didn't understand what was wrong. It was happening gradually, imperceptibly, and I didn't realize how it was affecting me. You were taking away my confidence. You were taking away my freedom. You weren't letting me make my own decisions or speak openly about my desires. You were making me doubt myself, making me feel like I wasn't enough. I was trying to please you, thinking that if I was good enough, if I loved you in the same way, you would start to truly appreciate me. You told me I couldn't survive without you. You took my car keys, blocked all the exits, left me no way back. I felt like a prisoner, unable to leave that cage. You used fear to keep me close. You convinced me I couldn't be without you, that I would be lost if I left. It was like isolation, like a frozen world I couldn't find a way out of. When I tried to fight for myself, you became more and more aggressive. You told me I had to call the police if I wanted to get my car back. You kept me trapped in the house, where I felt like I couldn't leave. You manipulated me into believing you were in love when in reality it was much darker. You made me doubt myself and my right to freedom and convinced me that I couldn't live without your love. But as soon as you left, I felt a strange silence. At first it was frightening. My world seemed to be engulfed in emptiness, but after a while I realized that it wasn't emptiness, but space for me, space to be myself. I began to realize how much energy had gone into maintaining this life, how much effort I had spent to please you, to be worthy of your love. And when you disappeared, I finally began to see myself. Without your influence, I could be honest with myself. I could be real. I remembered telling myself that I deserved better, that I deserved to be loved and respected. But your words, your actions, your presence drained me of all my strength, made it hard to believe that. I wasn't confident in myself. I doubted my worth. I let you convince me that my life would be ruined if I wasn't with you. You said that if I left, I would be alone, that no one would love me, that I would be nothing. But now I see that it was all a lie. Your words were empty. Your love was a deception that became more obvious with each passing day. I saw how you didn't love me, but only tried to control me, manipulate me, keep me in fear. You tried to make me believe that I was incapable of more, that I couldn't live without you. And now that you're gone, I've begun to realize how much I've been through. I forgave you for everything you did because I believed that you would change, that you would start to love me for real, but you didn't. You were still the same person I didn't want to see. And now I see how it all poisoned my life. You stole years from me that I could have spent searching for real love, real freedom. I had to go through pain to realize that I deserved happiness. But now I feel liberation filling me. I no longer try to please you. I no longer try to find excuses for your behavior. I no longer try to deserve your love because I know it was never real. I stood in front of myself and a new world opened up before me. A world where I could be strong, independent, free. I could build my life again, without fear, without regret. I could be honest with myself and not be afraid to be vulnerable. I could live for myself without thinking about what I needed to please someone else. Your absence opened my eyes to many things. I began to see the world in a new way, and it was amazing. The months after you left were the hardest and most liberating. I never thought I would experience this moment when I would have to face the reality of being without you. At first it was scary, empty, and desperate. It was as if the whole world had lost its meaning, and I was standing alone on a cliff, not knowing which way to go. But over time, I realized that this emptiness was not the end, but the opportunity for a new beginning. Everything seemed so harsh and alien at first. I couldn't get used to the silence in the house, to not hearing your footsteps, your words that were always in the air, like a heavy cloud. At first I felt abandoned, as if everything I knew had dissolved into the abyss. But one day when I woke up, I realized that this world was my world. I didn't have to live in this chaos, where my every step depended on what you would say or do. I started to rebuild my life, step by step. It wasn't easy, because I had to rethink every action, every choice. I was learning to live for myself, and it was both scary and exciting. All these years I had been drowning in dependence on you, on your opinion, on your control, and now I had to choose to be myself or to continue to carry this weight that you placed on my shoulders. I started with the smallest steps. I restored the habits that once brought me joy. I returned to the music that was once my salvation, but which I abandoned because of your eternal complaints and claims. The music that once filled all my emotions and made me alive began to sound again. I felt how it restored me, how its rhythms and melodies helped me forget about the pain, about the fears that once lived inside me. I learned to be myself even in small ways. For example, I started cooking for myself again, like I used to. I started experimenting with new recipes, enjoying every moment when I cooked. It was my little act of resistance, my way of taking back control. Thinking back to all those days when I cooked for you, when you never asked about my preferences, when your expectations and demands clouded my own perception of what I liked, I realized that I could do things differently. I could cook what I enjoyed, not what you wanted. I started reading again. Books I once loved but abandoned because your shadow always hung over me, blocking everything I tried to do. Reading became a source of inspiration for me again, as it had been before. I was immersed in worlds that were so far from the one I lived in with you. And in these worlds, I felt free, if only for a while, but enough to feel its power. I learned to set boundaries. I no longer allowed people to abuse my kindness, my compliance. At some point, I realized that I could not allow myself to become a victim again, like I once was with you. I began to say no, and it was liberating. I was not afraid of being rejected. I was not afraid of losing people if their opinion of me depended only on how convenient I was for them. I learned to respect myself and my needs. During this time, I was also confronting parts of myself that I had once repressed. I began to understand that my fears and anxieties were not just accidents, but consequences of the life I had led with you. I learned to acknowledge my weaknesses and my vulnerabilities, but this was not a sign of defeat. It was the first step to healing. I allowed myself to be imperfect, allowed myself to feel pain, and then let it go. It was like a cleansing, letting go of all the heaviness that once weighed down every breath I took. I started trusting people again, albeit cautiously. I met people who genuinely cared about me, and this was a new experience for me. I realized that trust does not always have to be compromised, that people can be kind without asking for anything in return. It was a new way of looking at the world, which had previously seemed alien, cold, and full of hypocrisy. I began to open up to these people, allowing myself to feel supported, but not dependent on it. I understood that now I can be strong alone, but that I can also accept help without seeing it as weakness. I learned the scale my life, but it was one day, I wasn't prepared for the fact that sometimes in life you have to relearn, like a child who is just learning to walk. but I accepted it as a natural part of the process. I didn't strive for perfection. I strived to be alive, to be real. And every day that I allowed myself this sincerity, I became stronger, wiser. At some point, I realized that there was no way for me to return to the world that had been destroyed over time. I couldn't go back to where I was dependent, where my self-esteem depended on external factors, on how you or someone else perceived me. I realized that if I was going to build a new life, it had to be based on self-love, not on a constant desire to earn someone's approval. In this process, I also learned to forgive, not to excuse someone else, but to free myself. Forgiveness became an act of self-preservation. It didn't mean forgetting or justifying what happened, but it meant letting go of the chains that bound me to the one who had once been my destroyer. Forgiveness wasn't an act of weakness. It was the realization that I couldn't be held captive by the past if I was to move forward. Every day I felt more and more that I was rebuilding not only my body, but also my soul. I was becoming more and more whole, and this wholeness was not dependent on the outside world. My energy, which had once been suppressed, began to blossom again. I realized that strength does not lie in defeating someone or something, but in learning to be real, no matter what. I didn't know what the future would bring, but I felt ready for it. It was like coming home. And maybe that was the most important thing of all. I finally felt like I could be at home with myself. The moment I began to feel independent, the world around me became completely different. Before, it seemed to me that my actions were always conditioned by external circumstances, other people's expectations, an unconscious desire to please, and fear of what people thought of me. Now I could just be. This feeling of freedom was both scary and beautiful. Once I found myself on the other side of fear, I realized that I no longer had to justify anything. Every day was a new discovery. Suddenly, the world that had seemed so alien and hostile before became a place for my experiments. My hands no longer shook with anxiety. My shoulders were no longer tense, as if I was always ready for an attack. I learned to let go of what could not be changed, and that was the main step, to accept my responsibility for what happened, but to reject the blame that was not mine. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a different woman. The one before was almost gone, dissolved into the past. Now in her place stood me, more confident, free and strong. Yes, it was scary to look at myself in a way that was completely honest, but now I could allow myself to be vulnerable. I could be imperfect, and that feeling of acceptance became my new shield. The first weeks without you were filled with a strange feeling of emptiness. I still felt your presence somewhere in my life, in my thoughts and memories, but it wasn't pain. It was more like a quiet echo that gradually faded. I began to understand that I didn't have time for you to continue living, because all this time I was looking for a way out, but never allowed myself to see it. Now I was ready for a change. I started listening to myself, to my inner voice, which had long been drowned out by your words and actions. Suddenly I realized that I could be happy without someone's approval, without proving anything to anyone. I began to look for joy in simple things. I returned to activities that once brought me happiness, but which I abandoned, trying to please you. I liked to draw again, to dance, to walk the streets without worrying about what others would think. I began to appreciate moments of solitude, because for me they were no longer a time of fear and anxiety. This was my time to be myself. The world wasn't perfect, but I was no longer trying to fit into its framework to meet other people's standards. I learned to understand that life wasn't a race, and that I didn't have to achieve something to please others. It was my right to take my time, enjoy the process, and be content with what I had. I no longer sought solace in relationships that didn't bring me joy. My joy was now up to me. However, despite this liberation, I continued to face the realization that you can't just break free from the familiar framework. The habits you once implanted in my mind continued to haunt me. I could be free, but some things, their shadow, did not let go so easily. And while I realized that it would take me time to fully let go, I also understood that this was a normal part of the process. Instead of fighting it, I began to embrace my fears, my insecurities, and not try to make them perfect. I could feel sad, anxious, or even angry, but that didn't mean I was going back to the world that held me back. I now understood that these emotions were simply a reflection of what I had been through, and they didn't define me. I could feel them, but they couldn't be my solution. I learned to forgive, but forgiveness wasn't for you. Forgiveness was for me. It was my liberating force. I couldn't hold on to the hatred and resentment that had initially weighed on me, preventing me from moving forward. Forgiveness wasn't an act of kindness to you, but an act of self-preservation. I let go of what had held me in the past so I could move forward. It was like a cleansing. My life began to take on new meaning. I was no longer looking for someone to save me. I was my own salvation. And this was the most important realization that gave me the strength to start living the way I had always dreamed of, honestly and without fear. Now I could just be, live in the present. And even if there were trials ahead, I knew that I had the strength to overcome them. I no longer depended on other people's opinions, on what you or anyone else thought. I could be confident in myself because I now knew who I really was. And this feeling became the basis of my new life. Every day I woke up feeling a lightness that I couldn't imagine a month ago. I no longer felt constrained, didn't look for excuses for my actions or decisions. The outside world seemed so huge, but at the same time open to me. Every moment was like a step into something new, unknown, and I discovered possibilities that once seemed impossible. But at some point, despite all that sense of liberation, I realized that the past doesn't just go away. It doesn't disappear, no matter how hard I try to leave it behind. Sometimes it seems to hit me suddenly, like rain that comes without warning. In those moments, I felt the emotions I was trying to forget come flooding back. And even though I knew I wasn't living in that world anymore, those moments reminded me that letting go of the past isn't an instantaneous process. Sometimes it was a feeling of loneliness, not the loneliness I used to fear, but rather a shadow that stayed with me even when I was among people. Sometimes memories of you would come in sudden flashes. They weren't painful, but they would still leave a mark on my soul. I was beginning to understand that I hadn't let go of everything yet. There were still these moments that didn't find their place in my life because they were connected to someone who no longer had the right to be with me. The process of forgiveness was difficult, and I couldn't just throw everything that had happened away. But I realized that it didn't mean going back. Sometimes when I was alone, I could feel the echo of old words in my head. They were words that had once been a part of me. And even though they no longer controlled me, they still came to me sometimes, making me doubt myself. I realized that I couldn't just ignore my feelings. It wasn't about getting back together with you, but rather that I had to learn to accept these feelings as a part of me. I learned to be honest with myself, even in moments when it was hard to admit that there was more to it. However, the more I observed myself, the clearer it became. Every time I encountered a memory, I did not lose control. These memories no longer controlled me. They became an integral part of me, but they did not determine my path. I could feel pain, but it was not what destroyed me. It was what taught me to be strong. One evening I was walking down the street and noticed how the moonlight fell softly on the ground, creating shadows that seemed alive. And in that moment I realized that the past, although it leaves its shadows, cannot dim the light that I found within myself. I realized that I had learned to look into the dark corners of my soul, but not to be afraid of them. I no longer tried to run from my feelings. They were mine, and I accepted them. But that did not mean that they would control me again. I dove back into my art. With each drawing, with each line, I felt more and more like I was reclaiming my life. It was my way of liberating myself, not to ignore my pain, but to allow it to become part of my journey. I was no longer afraid to be vulnerable because I understood that vulnerability is where true strength lies. I began to feel joy again in what I was creating, in being able to express my thoughts and emotions through art. But I knew it was a process that wouldn't be over in an instant. There were moments of doubt when I still felt the echoes of old fears and doubts clouding my consciousness. But that wasn't a hindrance. It was a reminder of how far I'd come, how much I'd learned. One day I stopped at a crossroads and thought about how far I had come. I didn't know where this path would lead me, but I no longer felt afraid of the future. I was ready to accept it as it was. Not every day would be easy. Not every morning would start with joy. But I learned to be honest with myself, learned to live with the fact that not everything can be controlled. I realized that in order to move forward, you don't have to forget about the past. You just have to learn to live with it. Learn not to let it ruin the present. It was my liberation, not from people, not from circumstances, but from myself, from the fact that I once thought I had to be someone who pleased others. Every day since I decided to let go, I became a little freer. I wasn't completely free, but I was no longer the woman you left me as. I became myself, without apologies or excuses. I was ready to face the future without looking back. When everything became calm, when I learned to cope with the shadows that remained in my life, I began to look at the world in a new way. Everything around me was familiar, but at the same time, alien. Every detail, every moment seemed different because I myself became different. I was not someone who lived in fear, who hid from her emotions and tried to find comfort in others. I was myself, aware of my past but not a slave to it. I learned to be in the moment, to appreciate myself and allow myself joy without looking back. Some time passed and I started seeing friends again, feeling the warmth in relationships. I learned to let people be a part of my life, but only when they respected my boundaries. I didn't let anyone cross the line that I had allowed you to for so long. These relationships weren't easy, but they were real. But the most amazing thing was that I began to understand that this strength that was being reborn in me was not only the result of my efforts, but also a gift that I had received. I began to look for beauty in ordinary things, in the sunlight that comes through the windows, in the soft wind, in simple conversations with those who did not try to control me. I was discovering a world that was always there, but I could not see it until I got rid of the weight of the past. One of those days, as I was walking down the street and thinking about everything, I noticed how the sky looked. Not just blue, but with some incredible hue that I had never noticed before. It was a reminder that I had begun to see the world in a new way. I learned to enjoy moments that used to seem ordinary. I began every morning, but I wasn't looking for an ideal world because I already understood that the ideal is just a mirage. Reality will always have its shadows, but it was important to learn to live with them. I learned to be in harmony with myself and the world, not by rejecting my past, but by accepting it. It was a process that had no end, but I was ready to follow this path. Sometimes it felt like I was standing on the edge of a new life, ready to take another step without looking back. And every time I took that step, I grew stronger. The inner world I had built was the light that now illuminated my path. That day, as I stood by the window and looked out at the world, I realized that no part of me was lost. Everything I had experienced had become a part of me, and I was finally ready to move forward, knowing that in myself, I was becoming the light I had been searching for so long in others. Story 4. When I look back on everything that happened, I can't help but remember those moments when everything in our lives seemed almost perfect. We were like an ordinary couple, with ups and downs, with joys and disappointments, but we always knew how to do something to get the relationship back on track. At that moment, I didn't know that it was this ordinary state that would destroy me. I didn't expect what was to happen. We were just two people who found each other one day. I didn't even think that everything would start with such a small thing. It all started out as usual. Walks in the park, conversations about life, the laughter that always accompanied us, and moments when we could look at each other without saying a word. Everything was simple, but with each passing day, it became clearer that something was changing. I couldn't figure out what exactly. At first it was subtle. It was as if she was becoming more distant, but maybe that was just my paranoia. She had always been a little closed off, but now her silence had become different. That feeling in the air, when someone is close but at the same time far away. I began to notice how she opened up less, how her words became shorter, and her gaze distant. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was all small stuff, but the small stuff started to pile up, like rocks in a backpack you keep carrying, thinking it's insignificant, and then suddenly you feel the weight of it. She didn't answer my questions about her day. I could tell her thoughts were elsewhere. At first I thought she was just tired, that she'd had a hard day at work, but then it became clear to me that tiredness couldn't explain this growing detachment. And then came the moment when I first felt like there was an invisible wall between us. I asked her what was wrong, and she simply said that everything was fine, but I saw her eyes avoiding mine. It was not the response I was expecting. I tried to talk to her again, but she brushed me off. Her answers no longer had the warmth I remembered from before, and in that moment, I realized that something had happened. Maybe I was blind, maybe I didn't want to see the truth, but I no longer knew what to think. At some point, her behavior became simply strange. She became withdrawn. I remember one day she began to look depressed, tired, as if something was weighing heavily on her. I didn't know what to do. We had been living together for a long time, sharing joys and problems, but then I felt that something was wrong, that our connection was falling apart. Then she got sick. This wasn't like a normal illness either. I knew her, and she wasn't the kind of woman who got sick often. She rarely complained about feeling ill, but now her face was pale, and her usual enthusiasm was gone. I could feel that something was wrong. She became lethargic, irritable. Her daughter told me that she was vomiting, but I didn't know what to make of it. I thought maybe it was stress, overwork, problems at work, or something else, but I couldn't figure out why she was acting like that. Then the real silence began. I tried to reach out to her, texting and calling, but she didn't answer. It was like there was an empty space between us. I tried again, but she didn't respond. Her silence tormented me. Normally, she would have called me, texted me, or at least explained that everything was okay. But now there was only silence. And the more I tried, the more helpless I became. I was still trying to find an explanation for her behavior, but no matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't find logic in her silence. It wasn't just not now, it was ignoring. I felt like she was distancing herself from me. It was a strange but powerful signal that I couldn't understand. I was prepared for the fact that there might be difficulties in the relationship, but I wasn't prepared for her to suddenly disappear without explaining anything. A week passed and I felt the gap between us getting deeper. I tried to visit her at home, but she didn't open the door. I stood in front of her house looking at the windows, not knowing what to do. All I wanted was to just talk to her, find out what happened, why she was ignoring me, but she didn't open the door. I stood at the threshold of her house, feeling my heart squeeze with helplessness. She continued to ignore me and I started to worry. Not knowing what to do, I texted her. I didn't know what else to say, so I simply wrote, "I'm sorry for everything I've done. Even Jesus forgave Judas." I hoped that this would help her understand that I don't hold a grudge and am willing to apologize for anything I might have done wrong. I got a response, but it wasn't what I expected. She wrote, "God forgives everything." That was it. After that, she blocked me on all platforms and walked out of my life. And in that moment, I felt everything crumble. Not just our relationship, but me as well. I couldn't understand what happened and why she did that. It was hard for me. I didn't know what to do. My heart ached from losing her, but I didn't know how to put it all back together. I tried to understand what had happened, but there was no answer. I stood in an empty apartment that had once been a home, and I didn't know what to do next. Time passed, but I still couldn't get her out of my head. Every thought of her leaving, of her cutting off all the threads that connected us, sent a storm of emotions through me. First it was emptiness, then pain, then anger. I didn't understand how this could happen. How the person I shared my most intimate moments with could just disappear from my life, leaving me alone with unanswered questions. For weeks I couldn't move. Every morning I woke up as if in oblivion, and every evening I sank into the same emptiness, as if my days had been cut short. I went to work like a zombie, doing my duties but experiencing no joy, no excitement, nothing but the burden that had fallen upon me. I tried to work, to do my daily chores, but I always felt her absence. She was not only a part of my life, but also a part of my world, my habits, my daily routine. And now she was gone. I still check my phone often, just in case, hoping that she would get in touch, that maybe something would change, but nothing. I even thought that her ignoring me was temporary, that maybe she was just going through a period in her life, and yet nothing happened. I didn't get a word from her, not a sign. It was like she had disappeared. This feeling made me sink deeper into self-destruction. Why did she do this? Why did she just disappear? How could she just forget about me so easily? One evening when I was beginning to think that all this would completely consume me, I accidentally ran into some of her friends. I was standing outside the supermarket when I saw them. Familiar faces, her friends, whom I knew. We had bumped into each other in the store, and they had immediately noticed how I looked. They looked at me with concern, and I could tell from their gaze that they too had noticed how my life had changed. I tried to make light of the conversation, but they didn't support my attempt. It didn't take long for questions about what had happened to arise. They said they didn't know why she was acting like that it was all happening out of the blue. I felt angry, but at the same time grateful that someone understood what was going on. They said she had been acting strange even before all this happened. She couldn't explain what was happening to her, but that didn't make me feel better. It only added to the mystery of our story. Why did they have to cut it off like that? Why wasn't there a conversation? Why didn't she at least try to explain what was wrong with her? I realized that she wasn't going to come back into my life. And it was painful because despite all the pain, I still loved her. And even though I knew it was useless, I still hoped that one day something would change, that she would change her mind and come back. I knew it was just a fantasy, that she wouldn't come back, but my mind kept chasing that ghost. A few days later, I had to take it even harder. We no longer spoke. We no longer corresponded. All contact with her was broken. I tried to get rid of all her things to ease the pain, but as it turned out, they did not disappear. Nothing I did was enough to get rid of her. Then there were moments when I tried to imagine what could have happened to her. I thought about her life, her family, what was going on in her soul. She had always been a good woman, but something in her had broken. It was hard to accept. I couldn't understand what was happening, and I couldn't find an answer. There was only an empty question that I couldn't share with anyone. That made it even more terrifying. I was gradually overcome by despair, but soon it was replaced by something resembling acceptance. It was not complete peace, but simply a way to live with it. I tried to find a way out, but every step in this search was empty. I knew that I had to move on, but it was much more difficult than I imagined. And at some point, when I no longer had the strength to fight, I tried to let her go. This was my first real effort to at least take a step towards myself. Time heals, they say. I thought I could forget, but I still often feel her in my dreams, sometimes in my thoughts, and it constantly reminds me that I still haven't let her go. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get her back. I couldn't make her come back into my life. And yet I remained alone, losing hope every day that something would change. Several months had passed since I had tried to forget her, since I had decided to move on, but nothing and no one could distract me from the memories. It wasn't just love. It was something more, something that overshadowed everything else in my life. I felt her presence all the time, like some invisible shadow that followed me, but at the same time remained completely unattainable. No matter how hard I tried to start over, her image was still with me, haunting me in every daily step. I was never one of those people who could easily let go. I could break up, but I couldn't forget what we had. And then one day when I thought I had gotten over it, everything changed. I couldn't escape her. Fate decreed that our paths would cross again. It happened by chance. I was on my shift, heading home after work. I usually drove my own car, but that day I had to use the company car. It was already late, and I felt tired, but at the same time I needed to somehow distract myself, to think about something else while driving on an empty road. My body was detached from everything that was happening in the world, and my thoughts did not give me peace. And then, in the light of the streetlights, I saw a silhouette in the distance. It was her. There was no doubt I recognized her immediately, even though quite a lot of time had passed. We both found ourselves at the same intersection, and I couldn't believe my eyes. At first I thought it was some kind of optical illusion, an illusion from fatigue, but when I drove closer, I realized that I was wrong. It really was her. For a moment, everything around me was silent, and all I could hear was the sound of my heart beating in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Everything was mixed up in my head. Fear, anger, confusion. I tried to find the strength not to stop, not to turn to her, not to drop everything and run to her. But I knew I shouldn't do that. She was no longer a part of my life. She had made a choice, and that choice was final for me. I drove past, but the moment I caught a glimpse of her, everything inside me turned over. It was almost a physical blow when I realized she was standing right there in front of me. I could feel her watching me, her eyes following me. I couldn't give myself a chance to go back to her, but I couldn't leave completely without stopping at least once. She didn't come towards me, but her presence was so strong that I was sure she knew I had noticed her. The seconds dragged on like hours, and I made a decision. My hand instinctively twitched toward the brake, and I stopped, not knowing what I was going to do. My heart was in complete turmoil, and my feelings were overwhelming. I couldn't believe that after so much time, she was standing in front of me again. Strangely, everything around me began to seem real again. I felt a weight on my shoulders and chest as if the whole world had fallen on my head again. I stood there, watching her, waiting for her to say something, to make the first move. I didn't know what to expect from her, but something told me that this meeting would not be easy. A few seconds passed, which seemed like an eternity to me, and suddenly she took a step forward. I didn't know what she was going to do, but something in her movements made me feel that she had not just appeared here. She approached me, almost not seeing me, as if she did not believe in the reality of this meeting. I looked into her eyes, and there was something in them, the same familiar mixture of despair and pain I had once seen, but now there was more. Something had changed in her gaze. It was not the same as I remembered. Now it was full of regret and question marks. Finally, she stopped in front of me, and I felt the weight of her presence, something too familiar and frightening at the same time. Everything about her said that she wanted to say something, but the words just wouldn't come. I knew she felt the tension too, it was obvious. I knew it was important not to make a mistake. Not now. She couldn't be a part of my life again. Not after what she'd done. Not after everything we'd built had been destroyed in one moment. But at the same time, it was hard to leave her behind, like my soul was reaching out to her, despite everything she'd done. I opened my mouth, but in that moment, she spoke first, and her words were a quiet but piercing truth. What she said changed everything. She spoke softly, but every word she said struck me like lightning, hitting me with such force that I could barely concentrate. I didn't know what to expect, but her voice, though fragile, was filled with emotion I couldn't ignore. She said, "I know you won't forgive me, but I had to. I couldn't live the way I did anymore." Every word seemed to pierce my heart. I remained silent, not knowing what to say. I had been prepared for this moment, but now that it had come, I did not know how to react. I had neither the strength nor the words to respond. She continued without looking away. "I left not because I did not love you. On the contrary, I loved you more than anything in the world. But I could not continue to be with you. I was destroying us both." I was silent, but everything inside me was breaking. Was she destroying us? I felt my heart constrict with pain, but there was something in her words that made me stop and listen. It was like a ghostly revelation, too complex to understand, but too important to ignore. You don't know what was going on inside me, she continued. I was lost. I couldn't find myself in what we were building. You were everything to me, but I was a shadow of who I was supposed to be. I couldn't live by someone else's rules, even if it meant losing you. My thoughts were racing, and every word she said brought on a new flood of emotion. But despite it all, I felt myself losing control, like she was opening up a wound I didn't even know I had. You think her words, she looked, you're right, she said. I left because I couldn't be with you the way you deserved. But I can't change the past, and I can't take it all back. You don't owe me anything. I just wanted you to know. With that, she turned and walked away. I stood there transfixed, unsure of what to make of what had just happened. She was gone, and everything was quiet again. But now that silence was heavy, like a weight. And no matter what happened next, I knew one thing. I would never forget this moment. This moment when we both acknowledged our loss, when we both, perhaps, realized that we had failed to preserve what had once seemed eternal. After she left, the world around me became dull and empty again. I didn't know what to do with myself. It was a strange, almost weightless moment when you feel like a turning point has occurred, but you don't understand how it will affect your life in the future. I sat in the car, unable to move. My heart continued to pound in my chest, and her words sounded in my head like music that didn't stop playing, despite all the instruments being put away. It took several hours before I felt like I could move on. But move where? I didn't know. All I knew was that I needed to somehow deal with this inner turmoil. I'd always been a problem solver, a person who moved forward even when it was hard. But with her, it was different. She had become a part of me, and it turned out to be impossible to tear her away. I came home and opened the door. The apartment was quiet and everything seemed normal. But I knew that inside me everything had changed. I was a different person. How could I be the same if she was back in my life again, but now as a ghost? And what to do with what she told me? She was no longer a part of my life, but her words remained and I couldn't get rid of them. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the silence. I knew I had to get rid of this feeling. I had to go on living somehow. And although I felt my hands shaking and my breathing getting heavy, I tried to pull myself together. I closed the door and headed to the kitchen, hoping that a glass of water or a cup of tea would help me get my thoughts in order. But as soon as I sat down at the table and picked up a cup, a strange feeling came over me. I wasn't lonely. Rather, I felt the shadows of the past creeping up on me, giving me no peace. I saw her face in every corner of the room. She wasn't there, but she was here, in this air, in this space, in every moment. Shadows. I stood up and went to the window, looking out onto the street. I watched the shadows fall on the asphalt, the night slowly covering the city. It was dark, and it seemed like everything around was being swallowed up by silence. But in that silence, I heard her words. They never left me. I noticed. I went back. I turned. I needed. The morning. I got out of bed, breathing heavily. The world outside the window was not as I had left it. The water from the puddles reflected the darkness, as if the world knew about my doubts and was no better disposed. I didn't know what to feel. Years after everything that had happened, I still hadn't learned to let go of what had been. Everything remained as it was. Even if I tried to believe that I was forgetting, she was still a part of my world, inseparable. With every step, with every new day, I tried to believe that I would soon be able to forget, that I would be able to let her go from my life. But an inner voice screamed that I couldn't, that I wasn't ready. This process was long and painful. The shadows of her words and actions continued to hover nearby, either reminding me of the past or returning me to the moment when she left. Much time passed, but she continued to live in my thoughts, in every corner of my consciousness. I tried to distance myself from all this, but it seemed that every attempt was just a new stage in the search for oblivion. In the morning, looking out the window, I realized that this fear was again bursting into my life, like an annoying ghost. And every time I thought I had found inner peace, I was again confronted with her image, with her silence. I tried to focus on something else, to lose myself in things that seemed important, but it didn't bring me any relief. Every day I felt more and more disconnected from the world. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, I couldn't find the strength to shut out the constant hum she had left behind. I often thought back to the moment when I stood in front of her door and didn't know what to say. Every word I said was empty because I couldn't let go of what had happened between us. She was gone, and all that was left were the footprints I had followed, trying to find my way in the void. Time didn't heal. It just allowed me to look at the situation from the outside, examining all its details with a cold mind. I already realized that I might not be able to forgive her for what she did, forgive her for the pain, for what her absence left in my life. I didn't know how I felt about her. I didn't know how I felt at all. I was crushed, and it hurt me to realize that I still couldn't let go. But at some point, I realized that these weren't her problems anymore. These were my struggles, my experiences. She left, and I was left with what should have been left in the past. She won't come back, and I don't know what could help me get rid of this oppression. Too much was left unsaid. Too much was left between us. But maybe the worst thing was that I didn't know how to feel about her now. The pain was still there, but it wasn't the same pain I felt when she left. Everything had changed, and I couldn't go back. That day, every day I began to understand that my feelings and experiences were only part of this big and complex process. I needed this to start living on, to build something new, and finally let her go from my life. But no matter how hard I tried, this emptiness remained. Time passed, and I began to feel life gradually moving on. It wasn't easy, especially in those moments when it seemed like I was standing still, as if I was stuck in a swamp of memories and experiences. But with each passing day, I became stronger, and everything that seemed painful and unbearable gradually became less significant. I didn't think about her as often as I used to, but every now and then, thoughts of the past would creep into my mind, reminding me of what had happened. She was a part of my life, and even though I knew she was gone, her presence seemed to continue to pull me into the abyss I had once tried to escape. I wondered what I would have done if things had gone differently, but I knew there was no point in dwelling on the past. All I could do was move forward. At some point, I realized that she no longer needed me, just as I didn't need her. Even when she came back, when she came to me asking for help, I realized that I no longer had those feelings that once connected us. I had my own business, my own experiences, and I was not ready to bring her back into my life. She was no longer a part of what I was building, and I was not going to recreate what had been destroyed. At that moment, it was clear to me that there would be nothing more between us. After that, I went back to my life, trying to focus on what was important to me. I continued to work, communicate with people, build relationships with those who were not connected to my past. One of these people was my new girlfriend. She came into my life a few months after everything that happened. We started dating, and she was a support for me, as strange as it may seem. In her, I found something new that allowed me to forget the old. It was hard for me at first, but over time, I realized that this was exactly the kind of person I needed. She was open and sincere, and in her presence, I felt like I could trust people again. It was like breathing lightly at a time when the air around me seemed thick and heavy. I truly enjoyed her company, her care, and she helped me find strength in myself that I didn't know I had. It had been about 1.5 years since everything that had happened with my ex. And then, one day after a long silence, she reappeared in my life, but not in the form I knew. It wasn't a meeting, not a desire to talk. Everything happened through messages, as before. I wasn't ready to open up again. Even if there was sincerity in her words, I couldn't return to the world that had once been mine. I blocked her number, just like before, because I couldn't allow myself to be involved in her life again. She tried to reach me, leaving messages asking for forgiveness, but I didn't care. I didn't feel any anger or hatred, but I felt like this chapter needed to be closed. My heart wasn't ready to go through the same journey I had already endured again. Forgiveness had come a long time ago, and it didn't require anything more from me. I was no longer the person who would allow her back into my life. I knew that I was now ready to move on. I had a new life, new goals, and people who supported me. I wasn't alone, and that was important. I will never forget what happened, but I learned to let go. I realized that everything in life has an end, and that end was necessary to begin something new. She had become part of my past, and I accepted it. It was my closure, my final forgiveness. I had found my way, and now there was a new road ahead of me. After all, I was happy with the one I was currently walking through life with. We had already talked about the future, and that future did not include someone who had once been a part of my life. All that was left were memories, and they no longer tormented me. I realized that despite everything I had been through, despite the feelings that had once been strong and alive, I had learned to let go. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't mean going back, but rather releasing. And now, because of that release, I could move on.